got a great group here today to talk about some key things going on with budgeting and what is sound budgeting, what that means maybe for the federal level, at the state level, and what we should be looking to do in the future when it comes to fiscal rules, tax relief, that sort of thing. And we need a lot of that right now as prices continue to ratchet up. Inflation came out today at 7.9% for CPI year over year. That's the highest in 40 years. And so when we're thinking about inflation and everything else, a lot of things are hitting people in their pocketbook. One of those being higher taxes, which comes from increased government spending and debt, whether it be now or in the future. So we've got a lot to talk about today, and I really just want to jump right in with this great group who I'm excited and pleased to have join me today. As I've been reading a lot of their work and learning from their work for a number of years, it's really a pleasure to have them here today. We're going to kind of go through each one of them, giving a quick dialogue about maybe a little bit about themselves and some of their key thoughts about sound budgeting just in general, and what they've learned from other places around the globe, but also from the states, and what we should be doing at the federal level. So we're going to have a great discussion today. So thank you again for joining us. So let's jump right in. Dan Mitchell is the first person I'd like to turn to first. I've been reading his work for a number of years, and he just does a great job of explaining budgeting, sound budgeting, and looking at what other countries are doing. He's got a great blog and everything else, but I really want to turn over to him, let him give his overview of himself, and then give an overview about what he thinks about sound budgeting. Thank you for joining me today, and I look forward to our discussion.
Well, thanks for having me as part of this program here, Vance. I appreciate this opportunity and the work that you've been doing, especially the sound budgeting that you're getting through in Texas. I wish we could do the same thing in DC. A little bit of background about myself. I'm a chairman of the Center for Freedom and Prosperity. I've been in the think tank world for decades, stints at Cato, at Heritage. I was even on Capitol Hill for a little while, the U.S. Senate, many, many years ago, probably even before Vance was born, to admit my advanced age here. But what I want to do in terms of sort of a brief opening statement is make a statement that some might find challenging, because I think that among those of us on the center-right, conservative, and libertarian community, too often people make the mistake of thinking that America's fiscal problem is red ink. Red ink obviously isn't good. It's not good to have high deficits and debt, but it's very important to understand that red ink is merely a symptom of the real problem, which is a government budget that is too big and is growing too fast. I think the number one fiscal variable that we should be concerned about is government spending as a share of GDP. Are we above or below the growth maximizing size of government? Well, obviously, we're way above the growth maximizing size of government. That's problem one. Then operationally, problem two is that as bad as we are right now in terms of government being too big and diverting too many resources from the productive sector of the economy, our practical problem is that all the projections show things getting worse because of an aging population, poorly designed entitlement programs. The burden of government spending is rising faster than the productive part of the economy is growing. And in the long run, that's what we need to fix. If government is growing this fast and the private economy is growing this fast, we need to sort of flip those lines around, which is why I'm a big believer, not so much in balanced budget rules as I am in spending restraint rules. And I'm a big fan of publicizing what they have in Switzerland. They have something called the debt brake, but it's really a spending cap, and that's worked very, very well. And it certainly worked a lot better than the Maastricht criteria in Europe, which are focused on limiting deficits and debt. That obviously hasn't stopped irresponsible fiscal policy in France, Italy, Greece, you name it. But Switzerland's spending cap has been successful. And likewise in the United States, and I'm sure we'll hear more from Barry on this issue, but Colorado's Taxpayer Bill of Rights is effectively a spending cap. Now, is it as strong or as effective or airtight as any of us would want? No, of course not. But compared to the supposed balanced budget rules that exist in every state except for Vermont, I think what Colorado has with Tabor is a better approach. So my challenge to people is focus on what matters, which is the size of government, not so much how it's financed. And then secondly, if we want to fix that problem, focus on spending restraint rules, not anti-deficit rules. And I guess I'll close with this very important observation. If you deal with the underlying problem of government spending growing too fast, you automatically will solve the problem of red ink. Whereas if you address the symptom first, well, first of all, you can be drawn into very bad approaches such as tax increases, which in the long run, I think have a track record of not solving fiscal problems. So I don't believe in focusing on the symptom. I believe in focusing on the underlying problem.
Well, that's well said, Dan, and I'm in total agreement with you. Spending is the problem. What Milton Friedman said: the ultimate burden of government is not by how much it taxes, but by how much it spends, and that's so true. And it's not just the burden that it could have on the deficit and everything else, but it's also the distortions that it causes throughout the economy, of the redistribution of income throughout the economy in places where the private sector wasn't already going. So there are surely some key reasons for government, preserving and protecting life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But beyond that, there shouldn't be much more. And unfortunately, governments become too large, whether it be at the federal level or at the state level, and even the local level in many cases across the nation. So we've got some key reforms, and thank you for those comments. We'll come back to them in just a minute. I'd next like to talk to Barry Poulson, who we've known each other for a while now, and it's been a great getting to know you and learning from you over the years. And I'd like to turn it over to you next to see, what do you think about sound budgeting by governments? What's really the crux of the thoughts that go into you? And please give a little bit of background about yourself as well, Barry.
Well, thank you, Vance, and thanks for inviting me to participate in this meeting. I'm an emeritus professor of economics at the University of Colorado, and I've been working on state and local tax and fiscal issues for many, many years. I helped design Colorado's flat rate income tax. We cut our income tax rates here in Colorado by half, and we've cut them even more since then. I helped design Colorado's Tabor Amendment, which, as Dan said, is the gold standard for tax and spending limits at the state and local level. The question, what is sound budgeting? I'd like to begin with what sounds like an intuitively obvious statement, and that is that any government should begin with a comprehensive budget that is effectively constrains total spending. Now, I know that sounds intuitively obvious, but Vance, you are well aware, as serving at the federal level, that the federal government has no budget. There is no budget constraint. What they have is a spending program. If you don't start out with a budget constraint, then all bets are off. So the question is, how do you design a comprehensive budget that constrains total spending? And I think a major problem at all levels of government, including state governments, is how much spending is off budget. And at the state level, a growing share of spending is not even part of the total budget process. A good example here in Colorado is we create enterprise zones. My university now has enterprise status. Well, essentially, that shifted all of that budget off the state budget. Essentially, the University of Colorado can spend whatever it wants, issue debt, increase fees without any vote of the legislature. So obviously, it's not surprising that the University of Colorado has lots of problems associated with this unconstrained growth of spending. But the major problem I see at the state and local level is unfunded liabilities. This is also true at the federal level, obviously, but many states are not aware that the unfunded liabilities now are the major component of total state debt. It is the most rapidly growing share of total state debt. The states have finally, after many, many years, begun to report these unfunded liabilities in their GASB. Requires them to report these unfunded liabilities in their annual financial statements, but that's only recently. And states still have not focused on how to address this debt crisis that is a result of this gorilla in the backyard, the unfunded liabilities in pension and OPEB plans. So I'd like to come back later here and talk a little bit about how state and local governments can address this problem and using tax and spending limits.
Well, that's great, and thank you for those opening remarks, Barry. There's a lot to work on from there as we're thinking about state and local fiscal rules. And one of the key lessons that I've seen, and Dan, you mentioned this earlier, and I did want to mention your blog you have is International Liberty, where you have a lot of good stuff on there. It comes out daily, and I get your email every day. I'm always looking forward to reading it. One of the things that I was thinking about is when you're looking at these spending rules, what's the best things that you see across the globe? You talked about this a little bit already with the debt break and Colorado's Taxpayer Bill of Rights. And when we think about what just happened in Texas, in Texas, we started what was called the Conservative Texas Budget, which was a way to highlight what we should be doing, which was a cap on spending on the entire budget, all funds number, using population growth plus inflation, using actual data over the last couple of years. We have a biennial budget process, and having a 2/3 vote to exceed the limit. We started that in 2015. We tried to get it through the legislature. Even in Texas, we couldn't get it done. Passed in the Senate, and it would fail in the House. And then in this 2017, same thing happened. It got a little further in the House, but not quite. 2019, it passed the House Appropriations Committee, but didn't get through the House entirely. And then finally in 2021, we passed it. It's in law. It's not the Conservative Texas budget in total. It's all general revenue. So it's about 53% of the budget. It's based on population growth times inflation, kind of this compound method of 1 plus population growth times 1 plus inflation. And instead of just adding the two, not a huge difference overall. It will compound faster over time, but not a huge difference in the calculation or the number itself. They use the last 2 fiscal years and the upcoming 2 fiscal years, a projection, the average of those. And then it's a 3/5 vote to bust the limit. Now, it's a change in law. We have it in our Constitution of all non-dedicated, constitutionally dedicated GR, and it's based on personal income growth. That's kind of what's in the Constitution. But what they've now designated in the law is based on what I just mentioned. And so I think it's actually one of the strongest now in the nation. But I'm wondering if what we could be doing better and what other states should be thinking about in this process of what works well and what doesn't.
A number of years ago, I remember being in Austin and speaking on specifically this issue. And Texas, as you mentioned, had a rule limiting spending, but it was when you put in personal income growth, a spending cap tied to personal income growth, well, that doesn't actually in any way shrink government over the long run, because the private economy sort of is a proxy for personal income growth. And you're basically saying to the politicians, you can increase spending as fast as the economy grows. Now, that's better than letting it grow faster than that. So it's certainly better than nothing. But my golden rule is that the private sector should grow faster than the government. You do want to shrink that government spending as a share of economic output over time, assuming, of course, that you think government is too big. And I think certainly at every state level and certainly at the federal government level in the United States, that's a very true and accurate statement. My view is that the growth maximizing size of government, covering, as you talked about earlier, Vance, the core public goods, things government actually should do, government should probably be 5 to 10% of GDP. And certainly now, when you add federal, state, and local spending in the United States, of course, it's a little bit messed up by all the COVID spending, but we're 35, approaching 40% of GDP, even when you factor out the emergency COVID spending. So I think we have a very fundamental problem that government is growing faster than the private economy. We want to, again, flip those lines around so that the private economy is growing faster than government, and some sort of spending cap is the key, and it should be set at a level below the growth of private nominal income or nominal GDP. But then you also have to figure out, well, how do you enforce it? Because Hawaii has a spending cap, but it's allowed to be waived. I think it's either a 60% or a 2/3 vote. Well, Hawaii's legislature is overwhelmingly pro-big government, left wing. And so as a routine matter, they just wave a magic wand and the spending cap doesn't apply. So not only do you need to design your spending cap effectively, but you also need to make sure that your escape options are very tightly controlled, because politicians, when push comes to shove, they'll always want to kick the can down the road in terms of any sort of imposition of fiscal responsibility.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I love the way you put that too, about government spending growing less than the growth in the economy, growth in personal income, for example, because that's what we've had for a number of years of personal income. And another thing that's important to note is personal income tends to be highly volatile. where if you're going to have a highly volatile figure, not only from a government standpoint of trying to appropriate given the volatility of personal income, but the way I look at it is from the taxpayer's perspective. If the growth rate's going to be volatile and uncertain from how much government's going to grow, that also means from the taxpayer, how much is my tax liability, my tax burden going to grow from year to year, where you can start to some sense streamline it, make it more stable using something like population growth and inflation instead. And expectations are such an important part of our everyday life and our economy. But you can streamline that, make it more stable. That also helps to bring about more economic growth. So it's a great points there. What are some of the things that you think are not good practices? Things that we should not be trying to include in these fiscal rules that have just not worked very well in states or at the federal, at different countries and things of that nature?
Well, Vance, first of all, congratulations on getting your new tax and spending limit through the Texas legislature. That's a major achievement, I think, and other states I know are following your lead in doing that. And it's a very well designed tax and spending limit, and I congratulate you on that. With regard to what's wrong, of course, Dan has mentioned 32 states have enacted some form of tax and spending limit. Most of them have proven to be not very effective for the reason Dan said. They link the spending limit is linked to the growth of income, and as a result, states end up with tax and spending limits that are ineffective or completely ineffective in the case of Florida, for example. Good tax and spending limit has to be well designed, and I've always argued from the get-go that my Colorado Tabor amendment that I helped design remains the gold standard for the states in the sense that it has both procedural provisions as well as substantive provisions that make it effective. The substantive provisions are the ones that Dan mentioned. The spending limit is linked to population growth and inflation, and that turns out to be much more effective than a spending limit linked to some measure of income or aggregate economic activity. Secondly, what Tabor says is that if the legislature generates surplus revenue, it's required to offset that surplus revenue with tax cuts and tax rebates. And since Tabor was put in place, we have cut taxes and we've generated rebates of billions of dollars over the years. I mentioned that we just recently cut our state income tax as a result of voter approval, this tax cut. And that brings me to the procedural parts of Tabor, and that is you want to require voter approval for any increase in taxes or debt or fees. Now, we don't require voter approval for fee increases. Surprise, surprise, most of the increase in revenue in Colorado recently has been in more fees. But the fact remains that over the years, voters in Colorado at all levels of government, state and local, have been voting on tax increases, debt increases, and basically the only tax increases they've approved are sin taxes for cigarettes and marijuana. So a year ago, progressives here tried to raise the income tax and it was voted down. So you have to have that type of procedural constraint. We also require a supermajority vote to spend surplus revenue. So these actually, I think, have proven to be the most effective parts of Tabor is requiring voter approval anytime the government wants to take in more money by issuing debt or raising taxes. So I recommend that very highly. What we have encountered, of course, in Colorado is we've had a few problems with Tabor. Colorado has never had an effective rainy day fund. And so when the revenue falls in a recession, as it did recently, we have not really had a good effective rainy day fund to offset that revenue shortfall. So I would argue you need to combine a well-designed tax and spending limit with other rules such as a well-designed rainy day fund, a capital investment fund, to make sure that you maintain a stable growth of spending over time. We've not done that, and of course that's led many people to criticize Tabor and to weaken it at certain points. So you don't want to do that. The other thing that John and I are working on in recent years is a state debt break, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later if you would like. We think that this is the second generation, the next generation of tax and spending limits. And basically, we designed a state debt break, in which the debt break is linked to the TEL. And I know Dan has worked on Switzerland, where this has proven, a debt break has proven to be very effective at the cantonal level, at the state level, and as well as the national level in Switzerland and other countries as well. So let me, later I'll come back and talk a little bit more about how a debt break can help states deal with what I perceive to be a state debt crisis.
Yeah, let's definitely come back to that. I think that will be important as we're discussing this. So now we're starting to have more of these spending limits that are going on across the states. I've been working with about 10 other state think tanks of promoting kind of this conservative / responsible budgeting efforts, which has been, it's kind of built on the work that you've been doing, Barry and Dan and John and others for a number of years. And what we started with the conservative Texas budget in 2015 was kind of built on that, and now taking that to the other states. I know that there's a simulator, a fiscal simulator that's on Alex's website, I believe.
Yes.
That you it's not, John? Okay, but there's one that's out there that states can begin to use, that John has, and maybe we can talk about that another time. But there's some good opportunities that's going on right now. I saw Quinn is on the call. Quinn Townsend, the Alaska Policy Forum, they put together their responsible Alaska budget that they're working on during their current legislative cycle. John Hendrickson over in Iowa, they have their conservative Iowa budget and working in that space as well. But a number of others, Tennessee and Michigan and others. But what we've also seen is a huge influx of federal funds, primarily from CARES Act and then ARPA, American Rescue Plan Act, to where Texas received about $40 billion between state and local funds. $16 billion of that was more of this flexible funding, even though you couldn't use it for tax cuts or for pension relief. But in general, there's been a huge influx where Texas is looking to have now, after the end of the current biennium, which ends fiscal year 23, about at least $12 billion in surplus, just general revenue surplus. We also have a strong economic stabilization fund, our rainy day fund, that's supposed to have at least $13 billion in it. So we're going to have about $25 billion going into the next session that starts January of 2023. That's a lot for Texas whenever our annual budget is about $125 billion. Okay. So it's a lot of money, but it's not just in Texas. This is happening in other states as well. And one of the concerns that I have is these states are going to spend this money and they're going to use that as the new base where it's been inflated. And now we're going to grow government even faster. And what we've done in Texas is we've said, look, we're not going to include that as part of our spending limit, as part of the conservative Texas budget, because I don't want that base increase to happen. I really want it to grow for more tax relief. And you're seeing some of this happen in other states as well. I wonder what your thoughts are on best practices in dealing with this huge influx of money that's coming from Congress. They just got some more money from the quote unquote infrastructure package that was passed, the $1.2 trillion bill. And there could be more that's coming down the pipeline. What do you think would be best practices, Dan, of dealing with some of those funds at the state level?
I think you hit the nail on the head. Make sure they don't build this giveaway money from Washington. Don't let it get built into a bigger baseline. Don't put state government on a higher upward trajectory than it already is. So keep and maintain whatever spending cap that you have. And then hopefully, notwithstanding the fact that the Democrats in Washington tried to make it so the money couldn't be used for tax cuts, we've obviously seen some great tax cuts and tax reform happening in different states. You just mentioned Iowa. Iowa has just shifted. They're now on a trend line to getting a flat tax. I think by 2026, somebody could correct me on that if I don't have the date right. But yeah, if Washington's going to insist on squandering money and just pushing it after the states, the responsible states need to make sure that money doesn't wind up creating a more bloated government, funnel that money, notwithstanding whatever rules and strings are attached, do everything that can be done to funnel it to creating a better, less onerous tax system.
Yep, good points. Barry, what about you?
I think that the issue here fundamentally is a debt crisis at all levels of government. And I think that both the federal government and the state governments need to begin addressing the debt crisis. That money that is being transferred by the federal government to Texas is debt. They don't have the revenue to pay for that. They are borrowing those funds. So the last thing we need is more debt, whether it's used for government transfers or whatever. And as I say, I'd like to come back to this debt crisis because I think it's off the radar.
Ahead. Please explain that. Yeah. Please.
Yeah. Well, I think GASB now requires states to report total debt. And John and I have constructed measures of total debt for the states. Most states have a debt crisis. By that, I mean, when you add total debt, including unfunded liabilities in state pension and OPEB plans, most state debt now exceeds 10% of their state income. Now, what economic research shows is that at that level, states risk default. And of course, we have had state defaults historically, but the point at this point is this is off the radar because it's off the books. Most states are not really addressing the debt unfunded liabilities in their pension and OPEB plans. They're focused on bonded debt, and they think they're in good shape. So what our research shows is that most states have total debt in excess of 10% of their state income. And what we argue is that states can begin to address this state debt crisis by enacting a debt break. Now, a debt break is a very straightforward idea. If you have total debt that is in this range where you're risking default, you need a debt break that reduces spending until you get that total debt back below that 10% level. So a tolerance level for debt at the state should be about 10%. And what we have done with our total state debt data is simulate what would state budgets look like if they had a debt break. In other words, what if you had a tax and spending limit such that when debt exceeds 10%, you lower that tax and spending limit? What would state budgets look like? Well, what we find is that there are a few states, conservative states like Florida and Utah, which these are states where total state debt is below 10%. If they have a debt break, this will prevent that from getting above 10%. And not surprisingly, states like Utah have addressed the unfunded liabilities in their pension and OPEB plans very successfully. But most states are not in that shape. Most states have total state debt exceeding 10%, including my own state. If they had this debt break in place, once that total debt hits 10%, we would lower our tax and spending limit until we get that debt back below 10%. And in fact, we simulate this over the next couple of decades. Most states could, in fact, successfully address their debt crisis with a state debt break. However, there are a group of states, and you know who they are. We call them the zombie states. Illinois, Connecticut, New Jersey. These states have total debt in excess of 20% of their state income. 20% of their state income. And when we simulate this state debt break, we can't solve the problem. We can't get that debt break below 10%. These states are in effect in default. The only reason they have defaulted on their debt is because of the government transfers you referred to. They get bailed out every time we get into a crisis. Without those bailouts, those states would in fact be in default on their debt. So I think that citizens have really failed to grasp the magnitude of this debt crisis that exists at all levels of government. So stop transferring money from the federal government to the state to bail out these states. Start using revenues to address your debt crisis.
I agree. One of the things I was picking up over here is read this recently, a fiscal cliff that both you, Barry, and John edited, and it has a lot of good information there about debt, fiscal rules, even monetary rules, which I'm a huge fan of. I think we need rules that reduce the discretion of policymakers who too often get things wrong. I think this experience that we're having right now is another great example of how things are going off and really are going off a fiscal and monetary cliff. If you think about the amount of inflation that's out there, I mean, there's a lot of momentum, inertia that's happening with inflation. When you look at PPI, some of the raw materials that are out there and things of that nature, it's going to continue to ratchet up, even if the Fed starts to putting some brakes. This month, they're talking about, lowering their target interest rate, which maybe slows down their bank balance sheet and things of that nature. But there's a lot of other just fiscal and monetary issues that are going on across the nation that's been passed along to states. I mean, states are really going to feel the brunt of this, not only because of the things that are happening in Congress and for what the Fed is doing, but when you're increasing inflation the way they are, revenue is going to continue to rise at a rapid rate, which is contributing to this factor of maybe having increased spending that's going on as well. One other thing I should mention is my colleague, EJ Antoni, who's another economist here at TPF. I see he's on with us today. He had a good study out recently that talked about all those unemployment benefits, those enhanced unemployment benefits, what we call unemployment bonuses. Whenever that expansion happened in 2021 from ARPA, you started to see some of the states ended them early. Instead of waiting until September of 2021, they started earlier. Texas ended them in June. Those states that ended them earlier, they had faster job creation. The federal government has been limiting, hindering economic growth and progress and going back to work, which is really where you get the most amount of prosperity. And those states that didn't, we saw about 3 million more people that have stayed out of the labor market that otherwise would have been in. And it's just another example to the points that y'all been making of, Congress in many senses screwing things up, running massive deficits. And it's interesting, though, Dan, when Biden recently is saying that the deficit's going to be cut in half, and talking about how the inflation is an issue dealing with Russia and other places, how much weight really should be on Congress and the Biden administration at this time, given everything that's going on?
I think Joe Biden doesn't really grasp what's happening with economic policy. And probably the most incredible evidence for this is that Larry Summers, who was a high-level economic appointee for both Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, he's been skewering Joe Biden for what he's been saying and doing in terms of inflation, in terms of all the excess spending. And Larry Summers is no conservative, no libertarian. He's a believer in a big state, high tax burdens, but he's what I call the sensible left. The left that can add 2 + 2 and get to 4, whereas the Biden administration, it's almost as if this administration is the creation of a nightmare scenario that you and I might come up with, Vance, if we were saying, well, what's the worst thing a president could do? Okay, well, you have inflationary monetary policy, you're spending money hand over fist, which of course is running up the debt and creating pressure for higher and higher taxes. So I think the Biden administration, as a matter of fact, I just did a 6-part series on the failure of Bidenomics, and he really is worse than Obama or Clinton. And actually, Clinton, especially in retrospect, from a free market perspective, was actually not bad at all. Now, you could say it was the credit of the Republican Congress post 1994. So I'm a big believer. I don't focus on party labels. I focus on what are the policies, and the policies of Joe Biden have just been really, really bad. There doesn't seem to be, there was zero retrenchment. People were looking at the State of the Union address. Does he sort of realize he's gone too far? And even if for nothing other than sort of self-preservation reasons, before the 2022 midterms, people were saying, well, certainly Biden will sort of, tack back toward the center instead of this sort of Bernie Sanders AOC agenda he's been pushing. But nope, his State of the Union address was more of the same. And so it's really, for those of us who follow public choice economics, it's really a remarkable story of a political party and a president who have just gone all in on the notion that if you simply try to buy as many votes as possible, the heck with the long-term consequences or even the medium-term consequences. It's all focusing on buying votes, creating more dependency. And for those of us on this call, I mean, we're not worried about the partisan political implications of this. We're worried about the fact that it has very negative implications for the future prosperity and health of the United States economy.
Well, yeah, that's exactly right. Barry, what would you add to that?
Well, I think that the progressives have somehow tried to convince us that debt doesn't matter. We shouldn't worry about the debt. We should just continue to muddle along the way Biden is doing at this point. And by the way, Larry Summers was one of the people arguing this a few years ago. He's seen the light now, I guess. But basically, their idea seems to be that if we can just service the debt, that's the only thing we have to worry about in the near term. If you just come up with the principal interest payments or pay the interest, I guess we shouldn't worry about it. Well, we've seen what happens if you let the debt grow at an unconstrained rate in states like Illinois and Connecticut and these other states. And as Dan says, this accumulation of debt is having a negative impact on our economy, on our rate of economic growth. And I think that the idea of beginning to address this debt crisis, we need to go back to what I call Jeffersonian debt principle. Thomas Jefferson argued that we need to be responsible with debt, not only as individuals, we should be responsible for any debt that we incur over our lifetime, but we need to be responsible for debt as citizens in the sense that if our government incurs debt, we need to repay that debt within our generation. We shouldn't pass this along to the next generation. And let me give you the worst example I can think of at the federal level. Congress is now considering forgiving $1.6 trillion in student debt. Now that's not peanuts. That's a lot of money. And think about it. First of all, a substantial amount of that student debt is already in default, but somehow Biden and the progressives want us to forgive $1.6 billion of student debt.
Trillion.
Now think about the
Trillion.
distortions that Vance, you talked about the inefficiencies. Think of the distortions this creates. We have lots of students now that will take on more debt anticipating that it will be forgiven. We have universities like my own that are going to raise tuition like crazy once this occurs, if this occurs. And think of the distributional effects of this. Most of the benefits occur to the upper income, the wealthy, the people who can afford to send their kids to college. So what we're saying is this generation of parents and students are going to shift the costs of their higher education to the next generation who will have to pay the interest and principal and taxes. And that is, as Jefferson said, not only is that inefficient, it's immoral. We need to emphasize this is an immoral government incurring debt like this and then simply saying, oh, we shouldn't worry about it. We'll just pass it on to the next generation. That's immoral. Jefferson was right.
Yes, totally agree. You know, it's interesting too, and Dan, you brought up this point about it's a bipartisan problem. I mean, this is Democrats and Republicans at the federal level and at the state level that have had excessive spending over time. I mean, if you go back to even here in Texas, if you go from 2003, whenever the Republicans have majority in the House and the Senate and had the governorship, right, supermajority there in that sense, you still had excessive spending for a number of years. Now, the last 4 budget cycles, part of it, I would argue, is from this conservative Texas budget approach, from the pressure that we were putting on the outside and doing that sound research. Those 4 budgets, we've seen some improvement. But if you look at the period, the 6 budgets before that, from 04-05 budget basically to the 14-15 budget, the average annual or biennial growth rate was 12%. 12% of spending. That was spending. Population growth plus inflation, 7%. So 5 percentage points higher. The last 4 budget cycles have had, these are appropriations, okay? The average biennial growth rate, 5.2%. So less than half of the 12% that was before. And population growth plus inflation is 6.2%. So it's a full percentage point below population growth plus inflation, which is great. But we're still paying a lot more in taxes and a lot more in spending than we otherwise would had we have been following that over time. And the same thing goes when you look at the federal level. At the federal level, through multiple administrations over the last 20 years, so we're talking about Bush, Obama, Trump, and now Biden, if you looked at that 20-year period and you said, okay, how much did the national debt increase? It was about $20 trillion over that 20 years, okay? Well, if you just match population growth plus inflation, just match that, it would have went down. We would have had a surplus of $2.8 trillion. It's a $23 trillion swing that really just says this is a spending problem, whether it be at the federal, state, or the local level. And John Hendrickson had a good question here. What do y'all think about spending limits at the state, at the city level or the county, the local level? Have y'all seen that happen much across the United States? Dan or Barry?
Well, but Barry can certainly address the implications of Tabor for local governments. I believe it applies, and I can certainly comment that you have the Swiss spending cap, which again, it's called the debt brake, but it's practically speaking, a spending cap that applies in cantons and in many cases, even municipalities. And it all comes back to the fact, are you letting government grow faster than the private economy, or do you have some sort of limit to keep government from growing faster than the private economy? A successful spending cap at the very least, should make sure government does not grow faster than the private sector. And if you want to make progress on that all-important fiscal variable, which is government spending relative to the private economy's output, you want to make sure government grows slower than the private economy. That is the golden rule. And I suppose, let me make a very important practical point. And this will be very relevant for anyone who does budget work on the state or the federal level. Revenues, because of the business cycle, are very volatile. If you look at the data from either the Congressional Budget Office or OMB's historical tables, you'll notice that in some years, revenue goes down. In nominal terms, it goes down, but in some years, it's going up by more than 10% a year. So you have this sort of very zigzag volatile pattern with tax revenue. So if all you have is a very simple balanced budget rule, well, the tail of revenue is going to wag the dog of the budget. And if there's a recession and revenues are going down, are politicians actually going to obey the balanced budget rule and cut spending by, say, 5% in nominal terms? Of course, they're not going to do that. And that's one of the reasons why I think a sort of vanilla balanced budget amendment simply doesn't work. It's designed so that politically it's forcing politicians to cut spending at the very moment in time, i.e. a downturn, when every political instinct on their part is to spend more money. And likewise, this is why the Maastricht criteria in the European Union haven't worked, because it allows that volatile revenue swings to dictate annual budget policy. The beauty of Tabor, the beauty of the Swiss debt brake / spending cap, is it basically tells politicians on a year-to-year basis, okay, you can increase spending by 2 or 3 or whatever percent. If the economy's in recession and your revenues are falling, you can still increase spending 2 or 3%. But if the economy's booming and revenues are growing 10% a year, you can still increase spending only 2 to 3%. And so long as that spending, long-run spending cap level is set at a level that is lower than the average over time of your revenues, your state GDP growth, your federal GDP growth, you're going to make progress. I really think it's critical. We want to look at long-run trend lines. And again, if government is growing faster than the private economy in the long run, we have to flip those lines. And if you flip those lines, all those horrifying numbers Barry was talking about in terms of growing debt, you solve those in the long run. Now, obviously, the amount of spending restraint you achieve determines how fast you solve the problem. But remember, government debt is anywhere and everywhere, always at its core, a problem with government spending growing too fast.
Yep. Totally agree. Barry?
Vance, let me jump in here with and tout Tabor. As I say, Tabor is, I think, still the gold standard. And one of the reasons is that it applies these spending limits at the local level as well as the state level. I would argue that Tabor has worked even better at the local level than it has at the state level. And for 3 decades now, if it has limited the growth of spending at the local level, just as it has at the state level. More importantly, at the local level, we have had thousands of ballot measures. If any government wants to raise taxes, issue debt, it must have voter approval. And at the local level, when you look at the thousands of ballot measures that have been put before voters, it's very revealing. And I think it reveals the strength of direct democracy, because at the very local level, at the, where you're talking about building a library or buying a fire truck, these measures are overwhelmingly approved. But when you move to higher levels of government, municipal and especially state government, at the municipal level, these ballot measures pass about half the time. At the state level, very few of these ballot measures pass. What does that say? It says that voters have more confidence in government at the local level because they have in Colorado this power of constraining the spending at the local level, and they can observe how that money is spent for fire trucks and libraries. When you move to the municipal level, there's less transparency and accountability. At the state level, there's no transparency and accountability. We did a survey in Colorado about citizens' attitude. What do you think the government wastes money at these different levels of government? And at the local level, they said, well, we think the government wastes some money. At the state level, they think government wastes most of the money they receive. So you need to let citizens have a say in budgets. And that's what this Tabor allows. And that's what I think should be true at at every level of government. I knew Dan's raising his hand there. I think he has an idea.
Well, what I want to add is that in Switzerland, under their spending cap policy, both at the canton level and the national level, there is no anti-tax language in that. Politicians do have the freedom to raise taxes to bump the spending cap up higher. But since you mentioned direct democracy, Barry, perfect opportunity to point out Switzerland, among all countries in the world, has more direct democracy than any other. And so politicians at the canton level and at the national level, they know that it's just a dead issue. They don't try to put tax increases in because they know that citizens are going to sign a petition. There's going to be a referendum, and the tax increase is going to get knocked out. So yes, having a spending cap is important. Making sure citizens can then stop politicians from raising taxes to increase the spending cap. That's almost like a 1B corollary to how a well-designed spending cap should work.
Yeah, and Dan, there's another reason that the debt brake in Switzerland works so effectively at all levels of government. They have a no bailout rule. No unit of government can rely on some other unit of government to bail them out. So cantons, municipal governments in Switzerland cannot go to their canton and say, bail us out, bail out our debt, repay our debt. They can't go to the federal government. The rules of the game set by their judicial decision-making is no bailouts. They have a no bailout rule. We need a no bailout rule in the United States. And if we had that, you'd start to see Illinois and Connecticut and New Jersey and California begin to pay attention to their debt. They don't pay attention now because they get bailed out. We need a no bailout rule.
It's a moral hazard issue again, right? Where government perpetuates these problems because of too big of government. It's one of those things too where government doesn't really stimulate much else other than just more government, if they stimulate anything at all, which I think there's not good evidence for that. One of the academics who's been writing a lot about this is Alesina, where Alesina has basically said that, in order to have more stimulative effects is whenever you have less government spending. If you're raising taxes to try to bring down deficits, you're constraining the economy at the same time that you're trying to bring down that deficit. You make the situation worse. And we've seen that time and time again. Instead, if you focus on the spending side and bringing that down, less distortions happen throughout the economy, and you actually have more economic growth, bring in more revenue and bringing down the deficit. And so it again goes back to this whole point that we've really got to focus on government spending as being the problem. We at Texas Public Policy Foundation, we have the conservative Texas budget. We've also been pushing the Responsible American Budget, which is essentially the same thing, a budget cap for the full all funds government spending at the federal level, population growth plus inflation, and then having a vote of no more than 2/3 vote, basically, for them to go above it. I think that would help. We need something to be pushed in that direction. There's also the MAP Act. That's by Kevin Brady, who's retiring. But I think there's some good aspects to that. I have some little tweaks, right, because it's based on potential GDP growth, and potential GDP, as we know, is a made-up number anyway. And it's based on the size of the economy and not focused on just spending. Where the way I like to talk to people about population plus inflation is it's freezing the per capita spending. Or another way to think about it, it's keeping with the average taxpayer's ability to pay for spending. And so that kind of gives you a way to talk about population plus inflation, because otherwise people are like, well, why grow it at that amount? And really, it's always a maximum. So I'm a fiscal hawk, as I know you guys are. I don't want the government to be growing at all. I want it to be cut substantially. So even allowing for some growth can make you seem like you're a dove. You just want more government spending. That's not the case. We're really saying this is a maximum growth. We've got to start putting some rules in place to hold these guys and gals accountable in Congress, the state, and the local level. And then finally, we're going to release soon what we're calling our responsible local budgets. So in Texas, we have this sea of red, and then these blueberries, the Austin, Houston, Dallas, San Antonios of Texas. And those folks are just growing government spending by massive amounts, which is then contributing to a lot of our excess across the state. And so we're going to start putting in place these that we're really going to look at the local level, kind of like what Tabor's doing, to say we already have it in place to where if you want to raise taxes, property taxes on existing property and raise debt, it has to be approved by local voters. But what we're arguing is we want a spending limit on all sources of revenue that come in based on population growth plus inflation to try to really tie their hands more at the local level going back to just the needs. It's all about priorities, as y'all know, from a budget perspective. So coming up to the end of our talk here today, Dan, I'd like to turn over to you, maybe a minute or two, kind of your closing thoughts.
Government spending is the problem. I want to repeat that 100 times until you tell me I've run out of time. But that's really the key thing. It doesn't matter whether you finance government by taxes, you finance government by borrowing, you finance government by printing money a la Argentina. In every single case, you're diverting resources from the productive sector of the economy and you're shifting them to politicians and bureaucrats that are more interested in sort of these public choice driven motives to try to gain power, get reelected, and things like that. We need to put a cap, a limit, a constraint of some sort on how fast government can grow. You mentioned Kevin Brady's MAP Act. I agree with you. Just put in inflation plus population. It's probably simpler, easier to explain. That being said, it's definitely the best piece of fiscal legislation that we have before Congress. We need to build upon that, and then hopefully starting next year with maybe a more fiscally responsible set of lawmakers on Capitol Hill, get them to focus on limiting government spending. Yes, it's perfectly fine for them to say, oh, balanced budget amendment, whatever. But again, that's very difficult in a practical sense to enforce because of the cyclical nature of tax revenue. A simple, direct spending cap a la Switzerland, a la Tabor. We have the real evidence. And by the way, even international bureaucracies that lean to the left, like the IMF and the OECD, and of course also the European Central Bank, economists who are experts on these things, who have studied all the different fiscal rules out there, when even these left-leaning bureaucracies are saying, yep, the only thing that seems to work is a spending cap, that should tell us something.
Wise words. I'm hopeful that we can also start adding in Texas as one of the stronger spending limits, but we'll see how that works. We're just starting that. Barry, last words.
Well, Vance, as I mentioned, I think we need to return to what I call Jeffersonian debt principles. And Thomas Jefferson's idea of debt was you may have an emergency military war that requires the government to borrow to finance the expenditures for defense in a war. But outside of those emergencies, you should be repaying that debt. And for 2 centuries, this is pretty much what we did. Progressives are trying to convince us that debt doesn't matter. Debt matters. And I think that what we're observing now is that at all levels of government, governments are not addressing their debt crisis. And we have a debt crisis at the state level as well as the federal level. And as Jefferson argued, individuals should be responsible for the debt that they incur over their lifetime. As citizens, we should be responsible for the debt incurred by our government within our generation. We shouldn't simply be passing this debt on to some future generation who will have to pay for the cost of that in higher taxes, more inflation, lower economic growth. We need to focus that and address the debt crisis today. We can't wait around and hope for the best.
Wise words. Thank y'all so much for joining me today. It's been a great discussion for our TPF Conservative Budgeting Workshop number 4. We're going to keep this going monthly is what we do, and we'll continue to share it online as well. Dan, Barry, thank you. John, I didn't get a chance to talk much today, but thank you for all that you've done as well. We'll have you on another time. Have a wonderful day, and let's continue to conservative budget and let people prosper.